Morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion of the joint concept for competing and a discussion with Ms. Lauren Lyons from the joint staff. I'll give you a little more details on Lauren in a moment, but just to set the context here. As some of you will know, this is the latest in a series of sessions that we put together on competition, long-term strategic rivalry, its implications for the science and technology domain and more broadly. And this follows our interest going back to 2015 at this center in long-term competition and our desire to update the thinking on competitive strategies that was set out in the 1970s and 1980s in response to the perceived need to compete with the Soviets for over a period of many decades. And what we found in the course of our work is that there's a lot of good churn on competition, but a lot of confusion and lack of clarity, uncertainty about the goals that should motivate the competition, and uncertainty about how the ends, ways, and means all link up in support of competitive strategy objectives. And then the joint concept came our way back in the winter. And it's a model of clarity. It sets out clear ideas, new ideas, well-argued ideas, and it provides a new benchmark for thinking about how to compete in a competitive strategic environment. And we're very pleased today to welcome Lauren Lyons, who is Deputy Director in the Office of Irregular Warfare and Competition and the J7 on the Joint Staff. She is the leader of the team performing irregular warfare analyses and assessments that inform executive decisions and develop advice for the chairman concerning strategic competition. She's been on the Joint Staff for 5 years, was directly involved in this process. She joined the Joint Staff after a period as an analyst at Booz Allen Hamilton. She has an undergraduate degree from Northeastern University in Boston and a graduate degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Lauren, thanks so much for joining us today. Before I turn it over to you, let me review the ground rules with everyone. Lauren will make introductory remarks using some PowerPoint slides. Her presentation will be on the record, so the slides will be available in the video link that's provided after the event. When she wraps up, we'll then turn to Q&A. Please be prepared to join the conversation by raising your hand electronically. If you'd rather submit a question into the chat function, that's fine. And I'll try and get it into the discussion in the time that's available to us. Lauren, you don't need to monitor the chat. I'll do that. We'll just make this a conversation with you and the audience. So let me, at this point, pass it over to you if you're ready to pick up the baton here, and thank you very much.
As Brad said, I'm Lauren Lyons. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Irregular Warfare and Competition. Again, sorry for that delay.
No.
Our office has been, we've been around since 2012.
I admire her enthusiasm for your good work here. So just don't worry about it.
I don't typically work from home, and so she's just being particularly bad for me. So anyway, we've been around since 2012. Our office is chartered to write the irregular warfare assessment for the chairman. That's our existence. Back in 2020, we added competition on as part of our portfolio, and our lead effort was to write the joint concept for competing. So Katie, if you wouldn't mind sending to the next slide. All right, thank you. So before I dive into the JCC, I just, think it'd be worth giving a brief overview of what a concept is, which I'm sure many of you who are participating on the line know and understand it. But for some of you who don't or are not intimately involved in the department processes, a concept is a future forward-looking document. It typically looks about 10 to 15 years in the future, and it's meant to be an informed analysis on what we think warfighting is going to look like in the future. It's typically informed by intelligence, and it is meant to drive capability development. So back in 2020, the chairman directed for us to write a joint concept for competing. At the time, the J7 was writing a joint warfighting concept. It was very high-end conflict focused. And during a tank session, they received a lot of feedback from the combatant commands saying, we get it. We understand how we need to be prepared to fight for a big war in the future, but what does this competition look like? At the time, the department was really shifting from a counterterrorism focused stance to great power competition. A lot of our thinking and our mindset of what it means to compete has atrophied over the past 20 or so years, as we were focusing on counterterrorism and the counter VEOs. And so we set out to write this concept to kind of get the department back into that competitive mindset of what it means to compete against great power competitors. We set out to expand these mindsets and really set a foundation for what this means. This included coming up with a common lexicon, really defining what strategic competition is for the department, and then eventually identifying what capabilities are necessary in order for us to compete. So that was the purpose of the JCC. It's a completely unclassified document, which is also something that isn't typical for concepts. We went about doing it that way because we specifically wanted it to be something that was shareable with the U.S. government interagency, as well as with our allies and partners. If you read it, I like to give ourselves some credit. It sometimes reads like an international affairs 401 master's course, what a balance of power, understanding dynamics, working with our adversaries. But what's really was foundational at the time is that the department hasn't been thinking that way. And so as much as people in the department were able to go to academic institutions or PME institutions and kind of get a taste of this document is the first time that the department has ever written down and said, okay, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the department? And so, yeah, if we don't mind going to the next slide. So when we started out on building the concept, we started with this military challenge, and we kind of we broke everything down to 4 parts. What does this mean to support the interagency? What does this mean to deter our adversaries? What does this mean to counter our adversaries, their competitive strategies? And then how do we prepare for armed conflicts should we fail to deter? In order to do that, we tried to take the strategic competitive environment and develop it and identify the competitive space so that it could be broken down into different parts. And that's what you see in the middle here, is if we were to try to identify how and where and why we could compete, we were trying to break that down into parts, looking at, the domains, for instance, and kind of expanding on that to include the cognitive domain, what activities we can take using industry, for example, advancements in technology, and so on and so forth. So this diagram you see in the middle is our breakdown of how we see and how we understand the competitive space, and then how you can kind of assess what red is doing within those factors against what we're doing or what we need to be doing. The JCC breaks down and identifies the nature of the strategic competition and the characteristics of it. Very similar to how we try to define and describe the nature and character of war. And then ultimately, we've came to the conclusion that strategic competition is a condition to be managed and not a problem to be solved. When the Department of Defense thinks of war fighting, we think of winning. What is the actual activities that need to be done for us to have some type of overall advantage? What do we do to decimate an adversary? Whereas when competition, it's kind of always going to be a slow burn where we are going to be vying for power against an adversary, and our actions and our activities are going to be focusing on gaining as much competitive advantage as we can at any point in time. We most likely, outside of a war fight, will not, through strategic competition, will not be able to totally decimate an adversary. And the idea is that this is like a multiple decade problem. It's something that you can go back 100 years and see how two great power adversaries are vying for power throughout the competition continuum. And what we have on our top banner is ultimately what we came down to for our definition of strategic competition, which is a persistent and long-term struggle, which is what I was mentioning about this being multiple decades, that occurs between two or more adversaries seeking to pursue divergent interests without necessarily engaging in armed conflict with each other. Katie, if you can please go to the next slide. So now that was all defining the problem. What is the solution? And what we came to the solution is that we need to have a different way of operating. We need to be thinking differently and thinking about how we use the Department of Defense and pretty much the military tool in the toolkit of national power differently. The Department of Defense is very comfortable in situations in which we are the lead, in which, you know, there's a problem, we have access, placement, and it's something that we can typically handle militarily, violently. And where we have more of a difficulty is understanding is when we are not in the lead, when we need to have an interagency partner take the lead, whether it's the State Department, Treasury, Commerce, etc. And what does that mean? Because we do typically have access and placement, because we plan differently than the rest of the departments and agencies, it is really important for us to understand what we bring to the table and how, when there is a strategic problem, the effect doesn't necessarily need to be a military effect. And this is that common phrase that you hear around a lot of, you know, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then, you know, that's every problem is a nail that you're just going to bang into the wall. So that was our solution. We need to develop different processes in order to do that, because of how much of a warfighting stance that the department takes. And our central idea for the entire concept is to tilt the competitive balance. And this gets back to that idea of, we're not going to be able to fully solve or fully win in competition, but what we need to do is be able to tilt the balance within our favor, so that it's our interests and the interests of our allies and partners that are able to be seen, given more success on the national stage. We've broken that down into 3 different supporting ideas. One is to expand the competitive mindset, shape the competitive space, and advance integrated campaigning. In order to do this, and as it says on the bottom, we believe that a structured approach is required. And if you could please go to the next slide, Katie. This up here is the structured approach that the JCC proposes. It's interesting. So typically concepts will identify concept required capabilities, which we do in this concept. And if you don't know what a concept required capability is, it's a requirement to say the Department of Defense needs to be able to do X. We need to be able to have stealth fighter jets. I make up the worst examples and I apologize for that, but it doesn't it typically doesn't give the solution. It identifies the hard requirements for what we need, and then that goes what's into capability development processes. We've also added on with the JCC a structured approach, and this is to kind of what we identify as that there seems to be a gap between our planning structure, which is the Department of Defense seems to plan about 2 to 3 years out, right? So in a typical JADER function, our J5 is really only able to, well, our J3 looks at the immediate problem. Our J5 looks at the 2 to 5 year problem. And then the J7 looks 10, 15 years out in the future. And what we've identified is that there seems to be a bit of a planning gap between this immediate, what we can do right now, and then in the future, what needs to be done. And in order to get at that, we proposed a structured approach that really starts at fundamentally what is within the US national interest, and then going through there to identify those sub areas, instruments of national problems that that can be used to get at that the problem set, then for us to achieve the strategic national interests, and kind of break down what this intermediate plan would be. What we're hoping with this structured approach, and it's things that have been approved, and my team has been working with the Joint Staff J5 to kind of bridge this gap with their global campaign plans to kind of expand that planning horizon. We currently only look at the FIDEP right now, and then that's because we can only look at what capabilities we have, and we need to be able to plan longer term than that. We need to be proactive in what we do. A lot of times we seem that our nation, I don't want to just speak for the Department of Defense. I can't really speak on behalf of any the department or our nation, but what we assessed and identified in the development of the JCC is that we really wait for our adversaries to make a move and then we counter. And we need to kind of flip that on its head a little bit and us start making moves as well in order for us to achieve our national interests. And we need to, what's really important is this unity of effort approach. And that's what I was saying earlier before about the Department of Defense not always being the lead. What's probably incredibly key to this is that we need to start identifying new organizations and structures at more of an executive national level in order for us to compete effectively. And what we're hoping is that with the development of the JCC, this is the beginning of a conversation, of a process. And as much as this has been signed, it was signed by the chairman earlier this year, we've been working pretty much since the end of the last calendar year on trying to be successful in what we're calling this area, the JCC value proposition. And if you could just go one more slide, please, Katie. And I think this is my last slide, so I'm kind of burned through my initial briefing portion, so I'm very excited to get at some of your questions. But this slide just shows our way ahead. So the JCC and the way that the J7's approach right now with concepts is that concepts are supposed to drive doctrine. Concepts are forward-looking in the future, the ideal, and doctrine is extant practice. So the idea is to make sure that where we want to go gets into the practice of what the Joint Force is doing every single day. So since the JCC has been signed, we wrote a joint doctrine note on the Joint Forces role in strategic competition. A joint doctrine note is a transitional document in nature. It is not full-fledged doctrine. If anyone here on the line has ever worked with the doctrine community, it is a document that can be written in order to put ideas out there because they are not extant practice yet for the Joint Force community to chew on and understand and to use. So we've written a joint doctrine note. It's informative. It takes the JCC and explains it in a way that Joint Force commanders can understand. And then the chairman last week, 2 weeks ago, signed Joint Doctrine 1, Joint Publication 1, Volume 1, which is Joint Warfighting, and it is the foundational doctrinal document for the department. The rest of Joint Doctrine typically falls out from this foundational pub, and many of the ideas from the JCC, from the Joint Doctrine Note, have been incorporated into that piece of doctrine as well. And now you're probably asking, okay, why does this matter? Why are we focusing so much on doctrine? Because doctrine is foundational, it now drives what gets into PME and what professional military education and what the members of our joint force are going to learn at the service and joint academic institutions. Because we are looking long term, we recognize that this competition is a problem now, but from our perspective, from a J7 perspective, is some of the best ways to get at that problem is to make sure that we target those officers, 03s, 04s, 05s, who are really in PME now, so that when they become general officers and they're the ones who are making the decisions, and when they are making decisions maybe in an operational role or in an advisor role, like what we do on the joint staff, they have a better sense of what it means to compete and also what options and opportunities are available for senior leaders to make. And ultimately, the joint concept for competing, we think, is the first step to expand the aperture of options for the department. From the joint staff, we provide best military advice to the chairman up through to the president. And right now, we have identified that if there is a problem, we're limited in the solutions that we're able to give. And so the idea is that for the JCC could kind of expand that the aperture of what we're able to propose, as opposed to just, again, like what I said earlier in the briefing, have violent military options for us to get at problem sets. So that is our big movement to implement this concept and push it forward, is focusing really on doctrine, education, and then also on experimentation. We recognize that concepts need to be continuously experimented in order to be validated. You can't just write something once and then just say, it's good, it's perfect, it'll never be updated again. So the JCC has been incorporated into multiple war games and experimentations since its signature, so that we can continuously tease out what needs to change. Is there things that we didn't assess, and then incorporate that into our joint staff planning processes, etc. I have the joint warfighting concept, that's JWC 3.0, on here, and I mentioned the JWC earlier in this conversation. I'm assuming many people are aware of this concept, but the biggest thing to know is that the JWC and the JCC started kind of together at the same time. The JWC has gone through multiple iterations, and the JCC the ideas have now been infused into the joint warfighting concept, so that the idea of warfighting expands beyond the spectrum, beyond that high-end armed conflict component, and it really includes the entire spectrum of conflict, which, if I keep saying the word spectrum of conflict, includes competition, crisis, and armed conflict. And so that document is foundational. It's driving a lot of the capability development for the Department of Defense. And what we're trying to emphasize is that many of this capability development could be hardware, things that you can hold in your hand, things that you can shoot, things that are used to help you shoot better. But capabilities also includes doctrine, policy, organizational changes, the entire .mil PF spectrum, and then and this non-material aspect is really what the JCC is getting at. So yeah, I think I'll pause there. That's our brief. That's the JCC in a nutshell.